I thought I would give this a try. Um, this is called the butterfly effect. How your life matters. How your life matters. How significant is my life? Do I make a difference? When I move, when I act, when I do something, does the universe notice? Do I really matter? In 1963, Edward Lorenz presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, stated simply, was that a butterfly could flap its wings and set molecules of air in motion, which would move other molecules of air, in turn moving more molecules of air, eventually capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Lorenz and his ideas were literally laughed out of the conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was fascinating. Therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the so-called butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, remaining for decades a combination of myth and legend, spread only by comic books and bad movies. So imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when, more than 30 years after the possibility was introduced, physics professors working from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. Soon after, it was accorded the status of the law now known as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. This principle has proven to be a force encompassing more than mere butterfly wings. Science has shown the butterfly effect to engage with the first movement of any form of matter, including people. Did you know that there once existed a single man who, more than a century ago, made one move that still dramatically affects how you live today? He was a 34-year-old school teacher, but on the hot humid day of July 2nd, 1863, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was in the fight of his life. A former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College in Maine, I may have got that wrong. He was now a colonel in the Union Army. Chamberlain stood at the far left edge of a group of 80,000 men strung out in a line across fields and hills stretching all the way to the little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Early that day, a Colonel Vincent had placed Chamberlain and his men on the 20th Maine at the end of the line, saying, quote, "Whatever you do, you can't let them come through here," unquote. Chamberlain couldn't withdraw, and he knew it. If the Confederate Army overran them, the rebels would gain the high ground, and the Union Army would be quickly defeated. In essence, 80,000 men would be caught from behind on a downhill charge with no protection. To win, the gray-clad Confederates would have to come through Chamberlain. At 2:30 p.m., the first charge came from the 15th and the 47th Alabama regiments. They attacked uphill, running as fast as they could and firing at Chamberlain's men, who were stationed behind a rock wall that had thrown up that very morning. The 20th Maine stopped the rebel charge and pushed them back down the slope, only to face a second, then a third charge. On the fourth assault, Chamberlain was knocked down by a bullet that hit him dead center in the belt buckle. Recognizing that he wasn't seriously hurt, the colonel scrambled to his feet, continuing to fight. Again they halted the enemy's charge, and again the rebels retreated down the hill. At this time in history, battles were fought with artillery and small arms ammunition. The struggles were close, face-to-face affairs. With their fourth charge, the Confederates almost made it to the wall, a thigh-high stack of flat rocks that ran almost 110 yards in length. As they waited for the next charge, Chamberlain felt sorry for his men. He later recalled, "Their leader had no real knowledge of warfare or tactics. I was only a stubborn man, and that was my greatest advantage in this fight. I had deep within me the inability to do nothing." The inability to do nothing. Chamberlain continued, "I knew I may die, but I also knew that I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am, at least, like the Apostle Paul, who wrote, 'This one thing I do, I press toward the mark.'" The attack came again. On this, the fifth charge, the 15th and the 47th Alabama broke open the wall, and fighting raged on both sides. Without time to reload, the men were swinging their rifles at each other and brawling with fists and knives. Somehow the 20th Maine pushed the rebels downhill another time. After that fifth broken charge, Chamberlain's younger brother Tom appeared with Sergeant Tozier, an old hard-nosed soldier. Tozier had a thick wad of torn shirt stuck into a hole in his shoulder where he had been wounded. "No help from the 83rd, the sergeant said. "They're shot to ribbons, and all they can do is extend the line a bit. We're getting murdered on our flank." "Can we extend?" Chamberlain asked. "There's nothing to extend," Tom answered. "More than half of our men are down." It was true. Chamberlain's command had started in Bangor, Maine, 6 months earlier with 1,000 men. They charged that morning with 300. Now they were down to 80. "How are we for ammunition?" the colonel asked. "We've been shooting a lot," was his brother's answer. "I know we've been shooting a lot," Chamberlain snapped. "I want to know how we're holding out. How much ammunition do we have left?" As Tom ran to check, a 12-year-old lookout had climbed a tree. He yelled, "They're forming up again, Colonel!" Chamberlain looked up to see the boy pointing down the hill. "They're forming up right now, and they've been reinforced. Sir, there's a lot more of them this time." At that moment, a messenger stumbled into their midst. Out of breath, he said, "Sir, Colonel Chamberlain, sir. Colonel Vincent is dead." "Are you sure, soldier?" "Yes, sir. He was shot right at the first of the fight. They were firmed up by Weed's brigade, but now Weed's is dead. They moved Hazlett's battery up top. Hazlett's dead too." Chamberlain's brother came running back. "Joshua, we're out!" 1-2 rounds per man at the most. "Some of the men don't have anything at all." Chamberlain turned to a thin man standing on his right. It was First Sergeant Ellis Spear. "Spear," he ordered, "tell the boys to take the ammunition from the wounded and the dead." "He did that last time, sir. Maybe we should think about pulling out. Chamberlain responded grimly, "We will not be pulling out, Sergeant. Carry out my orders, please." "Colonel, we won't have them again, sir. You know we won't." "Joshua, here they come. Here they come." Chamberlain stepped to the top of the wall in full view, crossing his arms and staring down at the advancing enemy. The 15th and the 47th Alabama wore their pale yellow-gray uniforms, now reinforced by a Texas regiment, moved up the hill as their high-pitched shriek, the rebel yell, coursed up toward Chamberlain and his men. Sergeant Spear was standing at the colonel's feet. Sergeant Tozier, Chamberlain's brother Tom, and Lieutenant Melcher, the flag bearer, were huddled below. Joshua, his brother, said, "Do something. Give an order." Chamberlain stood there for a moment, deep in thought, quickly sorting the situation. "We can't retreat," he thought. "We can't stay here. When I am faced with the choice of doing nothing or doing something, I will always choose to act." He turned his back on the advancing rebels, looked down at the men, and said, "Fix bayonets." At first no one moved. They just stared at him with their mouths open. "Fix your bayonets now," he commanded again. "Execute a great right wheel of the entire regiment. Swing the first left. Do it now." Lieutenant Melcher spoke first, confused. "Sir," he asked, "what is a great right wheel?" But the colonel had already jumped from the wall and was moving to the next group of men. Sergeant Tozier answered the question. "The means to charge, son. A great right wheel is an all-out charge." Then turning, the colonel pointed his sword directly downhill, facing overwhelming odds. Chamberlain slashed his blade through the air, and with a power born of courage and fear, the school teacher from Maine roared, "Charge! Charge! Charge!" to his men. The remaining 80 fighting men lifted their voices to match that of their leader. "Charge! Charge!" they cried, tumbling over the wall into a history about which most people in our country have never heard. For when the Confederate troops saw Chamberlain, the leader of the opposition, mounted the wall, they immediately stopped, unsure of what was happening, and then the colonel pointed his sword toward them and commanded his men to charge. They turned and ran. Many threw down their loaded weapons. The rebels were certain that these were not the same soldiers they had been facing. Surely these men have been reinforced, they thought. A beaten regiment would not charge. In less than 5 minutes, Chamberlain had his sword on the collarbone of a Confederate captain. Oh. "You, son, are my prisoner," he said. The man turned around a fully loaded Navy Colt revolver and offered it to Chamberlain. "Yes, sir, I am." Within 5 more minutes, the ragged group of 80 men under Chamberlain's command, without any ammunition, captured over 400 soldiers of the enemy. It's an amazing story, isn't it? And absolutely true. But here's what most people never consider. Historians have determined that had Chamberlain not charged that day, the rebels would have won at Gettysburg. Further, historians tell us that the rebels won in Gettysburg. If the South would have won the war, and the war itself would have been over by the end of the summer. Most people assume that had the South won the war, today we would exist as 2 countries, the Union and the Confederacy. Historians, however, insist that the South had won the war. We would now live in a territorially fragmented continent, much like Europe. North America would be divided into 9 to 13 countries, which means when Hitler swept across Europe in 1940s, had Chamberlain not charged on that afternoon so long ago, there would not have existed a United States of America to stand in the breach. When Hirohito systematically invaded the islands of the South Pacific, there would not have been a country big enough, strong enough, wealthy enough, and populous enough to fight and win two wars on two fronts at the same time. The United States of America exists as it does today because of a single man. One 34-year-old school teacher and one move he made more than a century ago. Don't you see? Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is a human example of the butterfly effect. One man who made one move, whose effects still ripple through our life today. And you are no less an example of the butterfly effect than Chamberlain was. Everything you do matters. Every move you make, every action you take matters. Not just to you or your family or your business or hometown. Everything you do matters to all of us forever. All of us. On Friday, April 2nd, 2004, ABC News honored a man who, at that time, was 91 years old. The news program was running a regular segment called Person of the Week. Usually, the honoree's accomplishments are listed in advance, and by the time the name is announced, most folks have already guessed the identity of that week's recipient. In this instance, however, the pronouncement left many viewers puzzled. And so, our person of the week is, the anchorman finally said, Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug. One can only imagine the frowns. Who? What did he say? Norman was the last name. Yet, despite our unfamiliarity, Norman Borlaug is a man who is personally responsible for drastically and dramatically changing the world in which we live. You see, in the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. From the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert Southwest, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's specific seed product flourished and regenerated where no seed had ever thrived before. Through the years, it has now been calculated that Norman Borlaug's work saved from famine more than 2 billion with a B lives. Actually, it was never reported, but the anchorman was misformed. It was not Norman Borlaug who saved the 2 billion people, though very few caught the mistake. It was a man named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the Vice President of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Wait a minute, you might exclaim. I thought Harry Truman was the Vice President under Roosevelt. That is very true. But remember, Roosevelt served 4 terms. He had 3 different vice presidents, and the second man to serve as Roosevelt's vice president from 41 to 45 was Henry Wallace. Wallace was the former Secretary of Agriculture who, from his one term as vice president, was dumped from the ticket in favor of Truman. While Wallace was vice president, however, He used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize, and Norman Borlaug was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But considering the connection, it was really Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people, because he opened the station in Mexico. Or was it George Washington Carver? You remember Carver, don't you? The peanut. But here's something that very few people know. When Carver was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who, on Saturday and Sunday afternoons, would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with a brilliant student. It was George Washington Carver who took that boy and instilled in him a love of plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. It was George Washington Carver who pointed 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life in a specific direction long before he ever became Vice President of the United States. It is amazing to contemplate, isn't it? George Washington Carver flapping his butterfly wings with the peanut. There are currently 266 things he developed from the peanut that we still use today. He flapped his wings with the sweet potato. There are 88 things Carver originated from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while no one was even looking, George Washington Carver flapped his wings a couple of times with a 6-year-old boy, and just happens to save the lives of more than 2 billion people and counting. So maybe it should have been George Washington Carver Person of the Week. Or the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. His name was Moses, and he lived in a slave state, but he didn't believe in slavery. That made him a target for psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders, who terrorized the area by destroying property by burning and killing. And sure enough, one cold January night, Quantrill's raiders rode through Moses' farm. The outlaws burned the barns, shot several people, and dragged off a woman named Mary Washington. Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Oh, this gives me chills. Now, Mary Washington was a friend of Moses' wife, Susan. Though distraught, Susan promptly set to work writing messages and contacting nearby farms. She got word through neighbors and towns, and 2 days later managed to secure a meeting for Moses with the bandits. Susan looked on anxiously as her husband rode off on a black horse. His destination was a crossroad in Kansas, several hours up to the north. There, at the appointed time, in the middle of the night, Moses met up with 4 of Quantrill's raiders. They were on horseback carrying torches and had 4 flour sacks tied over their heads with holes cut out for their eyes. There the farmer traded the only horse they had left on their farm for what the outlaws threw him in a dirty burlap bag. As the bandits thundered off on their horses, Moses fell to his knees, and there, alone on that dark winter night, the farmer pulled from the bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. Quickly he jerked open the coat and his shirt and placed the child next to his skin, covering him then with his own clothes and relying on the warmth from his own body. The man turned and walked that baby home. Moses walked through the night and into the morning to get the child to Susan. There they committed to that tiny human being and to each other that they would care for him. They promised the boy an education to honor his mother, Mary, who they knew was already dead. Oh boy, that night they gave the baby their own name, and that is how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise the little baby, George Washington. So when you think about it, maybe it was the farmer from Diamond, Missouri, who saved the 2 billion people, or was it his wife who was responsible? Certainly it was Susan who organized the effort. It was she who demanded immediate action. Unless, is there an ending to this story? Exactly who was it that saved the 2 billion lives? Is there a specific person to whom we could point? Or how far back would we have to go? How many lives would we need to examine in order to determine who it really was whose actions saved 2 billion people? A number that continues to increase every minute. And how far forward would we need to go in your life to show the difference you make? There are generations yet unborn whose lives whose lives will be shifted and shaped by the moves you make and the actions you take, and tomorrow and the next day and the next. Every single thing you do matters. You have been created as one of a kind on the planet Earth. There has never been one like you, and there never will be again. Your spirit, your thoughts and feelings, your ability to reason and act all exist in no one else. The rarities that make you special are no mere accident or quirk of fate. You have been created in order that you might make a difference. You have within you the power to change the world. Know that your actions cannot be hoarded, saved for later, or used selectively. By your hand, millions, billions of lives will be altered, caught up in a chain of events begun by you this day. The very beating of your heart has meaning and purpose. Your actions have value far greater than silver or gold. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever. This is a very good book. Almost a 30-minute read, but absolutely worth having. I'm thinking especially for people that are uncertain about their lives, why they're here, how are they needed, how are they loved, how do they love, can they take the next step? I just think that this is an important read. And I'm deeply moved by the fact that it was a story about George Washington. Because as a genealogist, and I know very well what my ancestral line is, and George Washington is in there by way of the Ball family, B-A-L-L family. He's a second cousin, 7 times removed. So there's a connection in there, and I don't know, I just think that this was worth reading. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I don't know. I hope that you got a lot out of this. I will see you again. Thank you very much.